Welcome back, everybody, as we continue here on day 2 of State of the World 2021 here at Florida International University in partnership with the McCain Institute. And we are delighted to turn to our next panel in this full day of sessions, which is going to look at the Biden administration's foreign policy, what to expect. And moderating today's session is going to be my good friend, Jonathan Tepperman, who is editor-at-large of Foreign Policy and author of the excellent book, The Fix, How Countries Use Crises to Solve the World's Worst Problems. And before joining Foreign Policy, he served as managing editor of Foreign Affairs and had been editor of Foreign Policy as well, and deputy editor of Newsweek's International Edition. So Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, David. And hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. So as David said, we're here to discuss what we can expect from Biden's foreign policy. And this is a topic that really needs no explanation, so I'm not going to spend any time introducing it. Instead, I'll just quickly tell you about our 4 fantastic panelists, and then we'll dive right in. So they are, in alphabetical order, Paula Dobriansky, a senior fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center and vice chair at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council. Paula is an experienced veteran of the US government. Among other roles, she served as President George W. Bush's special envoy on Northern Ireland. Bob Gelbard is a career diplomat who spent more than 4 decades in the US State Department, including stints as US ambassador to both Bolivia and Indonesia. Now it gives you a sense of his range. Michael McFaul is director of the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and a professor of political science at Stanford. He also served on President Barack Obama's National Security Council and as ambassador to Russia from 2012 to 2014. And finally, we have Anne-Marie Slaughter, CEO of New America, the former dean of Princeton's School of Public and International Affairs, and a former director of policy planning at the US State Department. Welcome, all of you. Thanks for joining us. Anne-Marie, I want to start by, and you'll have to forgive me for this, asking you a question I've asked you before, and that is a simple one. Is the Biden administration going to have any time for foreign policy? I mean, given what they have to deal with at home right now, a pandemic, an economic crisis, undoing all the damage that Trump did both to the machinery of US government and to the country, the impeachment trial, and so on, it seems like the Biden team will have a hard time finding time to even react to international events, let alone do anything proactive. So what do you expect to see?
So they're going to have far less time than they expect. And I'm saying that of a veteran team. So these folks know what it's like to be in the White House, to be in the State Department. They know the kind of fire hose of stuff that comes at them every day. Even so, they've laid out a big agenda. And I think if they have time to do the global health diplomacy that we must do, both to control the virus and frankly, it's probably what would repair our reputation in the world the fastest, and the climate work, both of which are urgent, have to be addressed and affect Americans' day-to-day lives. If they can do those 2 things and then just respond to what's coming at them, I will be impressed. And the example is just yesterday, a coup in Myanmar, all right, in itself, you think, well, yes, that's something you have to respond to. You put out a statement, you review sanctions, but suppose that coup is actually China's way of testing the new team. China's way of saying, what are you going to do about this? And we haven't yet figured out our new posture toward China, and we'll be figuring it out on the fly. And I can see Bob Gelbard nodding his head. Everyone who's been in government realizes that suddenly you didn't have a policy and you were planning to create that policy, and suddenly the president has to give a speech because something just happened and you're into the process. So much less time than they want, and probably much less than even experienced people expect.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. I'm going to come back to Myanmar in just a second, but I wonder if any of the others have thoughts on this particular question, which is what's going to happen to the Biden administration's plans Are they going to get mugged by reality right away, or are they going to be swamped by domestic priorities that just rank higher on the list?
Jonathan, I'll
Oh,
jump in. I'll
please.
jump in. I want to pick up on Anne-Marie's mentioning global health diplomacy. When I was at the State Department as an Undersecretary for Global Affairs, health was in my portfolio. And the one thing you realize is it's interwoven. So I will say, not in all areas, and I think she may be probably right in terms of, the vast challenges before the administration in the international terrain. But in this area, I actually think it's going to be very much interwoven, and where actually domestic issues have to be brought together with what's happening internationally. You can't actually get a handle around this unless you do that. And it was decades ago, maybe two decades ago, that the State Department realized how crucial it was to set up an apparatus to deal with international health issues. So ranging from SARS, avian influenza, Ebola, all of these before had also engaged foreign policy. And I'll also add this, Jonathan, when you look at it, such an issue is a national security issue because it has economic consequences for countries. It even has military conflict-related consequences, no less the issue of health itself and the welfare of individual countries. So I just want to point that out. It's very much interwoven, I think, and that's one area that I think they're going to have to collaborate very closely.
So that's a critical point. And Mike, I saw you just unmuted yourself, but I'll come to you in a second, although you can weigh in on this question as well. I wrote about this in my FP column last week, looking at the global vaccine rollout, which has been a disaster at this point. The United States, believe it or not, ranks actually very highly in terms of the percentage of its population that it's vaccinated. A few countries are ahead of us, like Israel and the United Kingdom, but the situation in Canada right now is a disaster. The situation in Europe is so bad that the Europeans are threatening to impose export restrictions on vaccines that are manufactured within the Union. Meanwhile, the developing world has gotten virtually no access to vaccines. And what I argue in the piece is that unless that changes quickly, that is going to have global ramifications, obviously cause a lot of trouble for the countries in question, but will also rebound in a very dangerous way for the United States for several reasons. There will be an uptick in unrest in fragile states, which could have security implications, as you said. But it could even have implications for the virus itself, because the longer that it circulates without being dealt with, the more likely we'll see the emergence of new, even more lethal strains. So to you or Mike or anyone else, what exactly can the Biden administration be doing and be doing more of in this particular area of global health, namely dealing with COVID?
If Mike doesn't mind, I'll just give a quick answer. I think, first of all, it's always crucial, the sharing of information, the sharing of best practices of what works overall. You mentioned vaccines, but I mean overall, that's absolutely essential in that regard. And that's why global health diplomacy fits in here. And then thirdly is, of course, the issue and the promotion of the vaccines. And there have been obviously a number of vaccines that have come to the foreground, and the importance of also looking at how one disseminates those vaccines. Of course, our country will look at Americans first, but I also believe that there is a game plan of also the sharing of vaccines. That's what we've done in the past in terms of antiretrovirals, where there have been other countries that also don't have the access. So that's another component of it, Jonathan.
Mike, do you want to weigh in on this or hold your fire?
Well, I was going to weigh in on the general question you asked, but it's related. And a couple of things I would say about the inbox that you started with. First of all, remember when President Obama took over, it was also the same thing. There was a big domestic crisis, financial crisis, saving the global economy. And I remember very vividly how crowded his time was. I mean, presidential time is the most important currency to get anything done in terms of foreign policy. And at the time, just because it's been extended recently, it's on my mind, we were negotiating the New START treaty. Our chief negotiator was President Obama. Nobody else could actually move the ball forward in our government because of the structure of the Russian government, because nobody there except for Medvedev could move the ball forward. And so we literally were arguing over time with Rahm Emanuel. I remember very vividly, Gary Seymour, for those of you who know Gary, and myself, we're kind of the team at the NSC where we needed an hour time of the president to move this or that on telemetry or missile defense, or what limits on we were going to have on warheads. And we were up against these other domestic crises. And I would just say the Biden team walks into that in a much more difficult situation where the domestic on all these issues overwhelms the international. And then number two, I always had this idea in my mind when I worked in the government, we could have these conversations about our strategy and, the speech we're going to give, and sit in the White House Situation Room and analyze a problem and admire the problem. Our colleague Bill Burns used to love to say that. We're doing a great job at admiring the problem. I always thought of my job as to do things, to get things done, to close out accounts was another metaphor we used. And the challenge for the Biden team in terms of foreign policy is, one, they don't have a lot of space already, as I mentioned, to get things done. And two, if we're going to walk around the world, I'll bet in a minute, but if you look around the world and you think, well, what is the to-do list? Some things are very easy. Reestablish better relations with alliances and rejoin the various clubs that the Trump administration pulled out of, and the JCPOA, or although that already gets into the Iran nuclear deal, that already gets into the harder things to do. But then when you think about the affirmative to-do agenda of the Biden team, rather than just kind of cleaning up the last 4 years, pretty tough list, pretty tough to say, what are you going to say after 4 years in government? Well, that's what I did in the Biden administration. And instead what happens is you manage relations and you deal with crises. And I worry that because of, the domestic agenda first, the bigness of these things they're dealing with, there's going to be a lot of management of issues, and there's going to be a lot of reaction to things that are happening rather than a proactive foreign policy agenda. And that's not to say anything negative about the particular team. That's just, I think, the structure of international relations and America's place in the world today.
And let me ask you a follow-up, since you served in the White House, which is there any sort of administrative or procedural best practice for a president who is dealing with this overwhelming flurry of different issues? What does it take to have a process that handles this well? Do you need a very disciplined president? Do you need a disciplined chief of staff? Do you need a mechanism for sorting out all of these demands on the president's time?
Well, in the Obama administration, and I teach courses about American decision-making, so it's not just the Obama administration, but I do think you want a strong National Security Council team closely aligned with the president. And that is a big plus that this team has. A lot of experienced people, as Anne Marie already said, people that know the president really, really well. The National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, is not showing up to work and trying to get acquainted with his boss. He's worked with him before. That wasn't true when I first showed up to the White House. When General Jones was a National Security Advisor, he'd never worked with the president, nor had he had that job. He wasn't even quite sure what his job was, to be honest, right? That kind of learning curve is not here. The Secretary of State, same thing, Tony Blinken, very close to the president, and also extremely experienced with respect to executive power, and for that matter, the entire apparatus of decision-making about policy in the US government, including the Congress. That's the good news. Then I think they need to triage their policy reviews, right? So it sounds like that's what they're going through. Remember, of course, that they're doing that right now with nobody on their team, right? The NSC people are all there, but they don't have any deputies, they don't have any undersecretaries, assistant secretaries. That's always a very strange process where You're trying to do policy reviews at the same time that many important people of your team are still sitting at the coffee shop across the street from the White House, trying to talk to you about what's going on with the Russia policy review for me. But then I think the real challenge is the proactive part. I really want to stress that. It's just the world is so hard, complex. Crises happen, right? So you already mentioned Burma, Myanmar. Alexei Navalny got on the plane, and right before he got on the plane, I was just watching his court case before we joined. His organization put out a statement saying, if you're serious about human rights, and they read very closely what President-elect Biden and his team said, here's the people you need to sanction to show that you're really serious about it here in Russia. And these were the economic people that support Putin, not these low-level FSB, colonels. In other words, all these other people have their own agendas, and they're trying to fill up your inbox with their agendas. And so I think it's hard to focus on the long-term strategic proactive issues. I mean, already has been mentioned climate change. It's hard to keep that proactive big agenda when A, you don't have much time, and B, crises crowd out, what you want to do in terms of your own agenda.
Sure. Bob, let's return to this question of the to-do list, unless you want to weigh in on the policy issue, the process issue.
Well, let me start on the, yes. First, I think the very important issue that Mike mentioned is that this is a team that the president knows. They know the president. They have been working together for quite some time. They don't come into office in an inexperienced way. They mesh together well, and they know what their priorities are. One very important thing is to establish a foreign policy. There has been no foreign policy for the past 4 years. I mean, that's just a fact. And going into some of the issues that have been mentioned, whether it's climate change or COVID, but also cybersecurity, other things, alliances are absolutely necessary. They are critical around the world. Even, we'll get into Myanmar, as you said, but even looking at something like Myanmar, we need alliances. The United States has very little leverage there. We need alliances in order to try to leverage the kind of movement that we would like to see. But on these issues such as international health, where the administration is rejoining WHO, rejoined COVAX, all these other things, it's very clear that alliances and partnerships are critical. And the issue of staffing is fundamental. There has been, the State Department has been hollowed out. When I have been following, I mean, as you said, I was in the Foreign Service for a long time. And when I look at the State Department today, it's tragic. We simply, there have been acting this and acting that in terms of policy. And when I talk to prime ministers and presidents in other countries, they have fundamental questions about what has happened to the United States and where we are going.
So let's now turn to the substance of the to-do list. Given your experience and the number of regions that you know, what do you think the rest of the world, or at least the places that you served, hope will be at the top of Biden's priorities? And is that list going to be different from the list that the Biden administration makes?
If I had a long scroll, I would unroll it at about this point. But starting in Asia, it is, I think, a powerful symbol to the rest of the world that Kurt Campbell has been named coordinator for Asia policy, and that staffing up with a very strong team around him at the National Security Council. I was just in communication with a senior government minister in one of the Southeast Asian countries the other day. They have strong expectations and hope in terms of the question of the relationship with China, but also how the United States is going to re-engage with the region. There were some, frankly, ham-handed efforts to engage, but it's critical that the United States find ways to re-engage, particularly on the economic side, starting perhaps with TPP, but also in other ways. Kurt Campbell did a really good job at the beginning of the Obama administration by having the United States government enter the framework of mechanisms throughout Southeast Asia and other parts of Asia. That needs to be revitalized. But on the economic side, perhaps through the DFC, which was, I think, one of the bright spots of the last administration, political activity and other ways, the United States has to find ways to re-engage. Just a word on a couple of other areas. There's been very little activity in the Balkans. I was President Clinton's special representative for the Balkans through the Kosovo War after Richard Holbrooke. We've left the field open to Russia and the Chinese. There have been valiant attempts by people at the State Department, but there needs to be strong re-engagement. In Latin America and Africa, I would just say, on the to-do list, these are vacuums. Latin American policy was restricted to Venezuela and Cuba with one goal, and that was winning Florida. The United States need to re-engage dramatically in Latin America and certainly back in Africa, where there was zero engagement during the last 4 years.
So imagine you're making that case in particular to the president. How do you justify that level of re-engagement when he is trying to navigate so many other priorities?
It doesn't have to be the president who does these things. The president can weigh in on a few occasions just to show he blesses what's going on. It doesn't even have to be the Secretary of State necessarily. But there have been so many instances where assistant secretaries, I mean, we're getting into process, but assistant secretaries are empowered, or undersecretaries are empowered to develop, manage, and implement powerful foreign policies. And I think that's what needs to be done, simply because, as we started out saying, the president simply is going to have to be addressing so much of his time, and the vice president her time, to domestic policy.
So Anne Marie, I was gonna come to you on this.
So I want to disagree.
Okay.
Just for the sake of the conference, and but I really do. I do have a different view here, which is, I think it's fine that Kurt is there and he has deep experience and he was very effective during the Obama administration. But if I were to appoint a coordinator in the White House instead of Asia and the Middle East, or perhaps at least in addition to, I would have a coordinator for Europe. I think the single most important thing we can do is to reach out, not to the separate capitals, but to the EU. And Ursula von der Leyen has offered a new transatlantic agenda on, yes, trade and finance, but just as important, on climate, on technology. We desperately need a common framework for governing technology that embraces the Europe and the United States, so that we can take on the Chinese view of the internet and the Russian view of the internet and many other countries, and really on industrial policy, because both Europe and the United States, and for that matter, China, are all redoing our supply chains to be a little more self-reliant. And so if we reached out to Europe seriously, to the EU, and put in place at least a framework agreement for ongoing negotiations, then when we deal with all these other regions, we'd be playing with a much stronger hand. And instead, and I think this was a mistake the Obama administration made, we're fixated on the Asian century, so we look west, but really I would start by looking east.
John, well, go ahead, Bob, and then I'll come in after you.
Just a word, just say, I don't disagree with Anne Marie at all. I completely agree. We need Europe to partner with us, whether we're working on some of these functional problems, such as cybersecurity or health or climate, or on geopolitical issues. And I fully agree, that's where we should start, even if the Europeans are being cynical, problematic, and mercantilistic in some of the ways that they scurried around with before President Biden was inaugurated.
Okay, Paul, I'm going to come to you, but I'm going to ask you a question first, and then you can add on what you were going to say. So hold that thought.
I might flip it. Okay.
Bob has raised a really important point, and I apologize for going back to process, but so much of what happens in government is a policy doesn't happen without process, right? And the devil is really in the details here. So you've all raised a number of critical priorities. The question is, as we've been discussing, how does the administration sort through them all and get them all done? One of the criticisms that has been made of successive administrations now has been the way that the White House has concentrated all key foreign policy decision-making in itself. And given the other institutions of government, like the State Department, less to do than they did historically. Bob seemed to be suggesting that this doesn't all need to be done at the center. So could reversing that process of centralization of foreign policy making and devolving responsibilities back to the relevant agencies, could that help deal with this overwhelming welter of priorities?
Well, I'll start with process, and then I wanted to address the issue of Asia, Europe, and just the substantive priorities. On process, let me just say, in terms of positions I served at the NSC in the Reagan administration, dating myself way back. And then I also was in George H.W. Bush, and then also in George W. Bush at the State Department. My personal view, the most ideal process is when each agency and organization does what it's supposed to do. The NSC should be a coordinative and clearinghouse body. There have been administrations I could point to where the staff has gotten bloated, and you're right, Jonathan, policy then is made from the White House and not actually in this case. And not only that, but the other arm, the State Department, could very well be ignored. And forgive me, because my colleagues may jump on me, but I'm going to give the example of the Obama administration, because the staff grew to something like 300 or 400. It should be the State Department that should be implementing. I do agree with Bob. I think that when we've had envoys at the State Department, they've been tasked with different types of responsibilities. I do think that it has worked and worked well. But there should be NSC meetings, there should be those high-level deputy meetings, bringing the whole community together where they debate it, vet it out, that it's transparent. And then the NSC dispatches the implementers and they go off and do it. So I think that what Bob had suggested, if you have a good NSC that's clearinghouse, coordinative, but not hijacking the policy, the reins of policy, letting the State Department have the space to do diplomacy, that works best. I wanted to come back to the issue about the priorities. And I will say I sort of cast myself a little bit differently. And by the way, I commend Anne Marie. I had a great piece at FT in which she articulated very, very well what she articulated here. I think where I differ a little bit is I do think we are in the great power competition. And I do think that looking at Russia, looking at especially China, we have to, in order to deal with it, it's not just only about us, but it is the second component, and she referred to, of course, how we deal with our allies, our friends. But I see it in not just only Europe, the alliances and the partnerships that we have forged in the Indo-Pacific have been crucial. It's well gone beyond the Quad Plus, which was Japan, India, US, and Australia. Now, the original Quad, it's now the Quad Plus, which involves Korea, Vietnam, as well as New Zealand. And I think you're going to see more of that happening in Asia, which matters greatly to how we deal with China. And I think with regard to Europe, the only difference I have is, personally, I am of the view, I think that the EU needs some reforms. I have many European friends who have complained that they don't feel that it has reformed itself. So that's why I have a little difference with you, Anne Marie, about centralizing a coordinative role through Brussels. But I do think the role, our transatlantic partnership matters. I think a challenge for the Biden administration is going to be the fact that the EU just went forward with that investment agreement with China, and that already puts it in a certain place on markets. And that kind of forces the Biden administration to kind of catch up on that. So simply put, I think we're in great power competition. I would put that first. I do think our alliances, which the administration has cited, are important. Europe, certainly the partnerships in Asia matter. And then in that mix, I think we should also be looking at new partners. That's why I mentioned in Quad Plus. To me, it's very interesting, the mix of bringing Vietnam into that overall calculation economically. Very interesting times indeed.
Mike, Anne-Marie mentioned Myanmar at the top, and I think you did as well, and I don't want to let it slip away. I think it's really interesting to focus on because it presents a particular challenge to the Biden administration, not just because it's breaking right now, but because it stands at the intersection of two issues that the administration has said it's going to make priorities. One is its democracy agenda, and two is relations with China. So what should the administration be doing?
What should they do on Burma or Myanmar? And there's a debate about what word we're supposed to use these days, by the way. Let me get to, I want to say one thing on this process too, if I may, because everybody's piling up. Just a couple of little things to echo some of my colleagues. First of all, I'll bet you your listeners don't know the difference between a senior director, a coordinator, and a deputy national security advisor. 99.9% of the world doesn't know the difference at the White House. The people that pay attention to that are the ambassadors in Washington and their diplomats. And just to underscore what Anne-Marie said from my interactions with foreign governments, the idea that the NSC decided to have a coordinator for Asia, that's Kurt Campbell, and a coordinator for the Middle East, that's Brett McGurk, my former colleague here at Stanford, and not a coordinator for Europe is Ben noticed. The coordinator is just a little tiny, I remember when I saw it on the org chart, it's just a little bump up. It's below Deputy National Security Advisor, above Senior Director. That makes them just a little more special. And it allows them to have some senior directors report to them. But that's a signal. That's a signal that those things are important. Others people have noted that just with respect to what Anne-Marie said. There's another paradox I think is really interesting so far. Maybe it'll shake itself out as the team fills out. But if you remember during the campaign, the Biden teams, as a candidate and president-elect, always said, we need a foreign policy for the middle class. We want to blur the lines between domestic and foreign. Jake Sullivan in particular has said that and written about that himself rather eloquently. And of course, I believe that. I think it's been overstated that somehow Trump did that and other people didn't do that. I've never read or served for a president that didn't put America first. It was a real cartoonization. But there is this paradox so far that in filling out their team, what they've really done is internationalized domestic policy. So who is the head of the Domestic Policy Council? It's Susan Rice, the former National Security Advisor. Who's the head of Homeland Security? It's Elizabeth Sherwood Randall, somebody well-known, former, used to be the Senior Director of Europe. Who's running Veterans Affairs? Dennis McDonough, former Deputy National Security Advisor. And then you throw into the mix at that White House situation where everybody's talking about, over at CIA, you have one of the most experienced diplomats in the world, Bill Burns. And there's this guy named John Kerry, who's supposed to be working on climate change, but I've worked close enough with Secretary Kerry. I guarantee you that Susan Rice, John Kerry, Bill Burns, Dennis McDonough, when the topic of Myanmar and China comes up and they're supposed to be talking about their other things, my guess is in a meeting chaired by these new people that they're going to be speaking up as well. And I think that's a really interesting challenge.
But is that a good thing for process to have these big personalities who are not supposed to be involved in the process weighing in as well?
I think it's a real challenge, particularly with intelligence. I mean, Bill Burns is an old personal friend of mine. I meant what I said. I think he's probably one of the most talented diplomats we've had, at least in my lifetime. But I did not like the fact, to be blunt with you, that our intelligence community, who, by the way, when they come to these meetings, they get two chairs at the table, right? Avril Haines and Bill Burns will be coming. She's the Director of National Intelligence. State Department only gets one sometimes, depending on how they mix that up. And I think the over militarization and over, intelligencization, I know that's not a word, of foreign policy making needs to be corrected. But it's a very difficult thing to do for people in those jobs when they think they know a lot about these subject matters. In my case, Russia, very experienced people from the intelligence world. Turns out that it's hard to check their policy ideas at the door. And that gets me to your absolutely excellent question about the challenges of aspiration and what you said you're going to do versus now how do you do it, right? So very correctly, in my view, candidate Biden, President-elect Biden, and now President Biden and his team have said that we're going to bring values, morality, human rights, ideas about democracy as part of our agenda, right? So they're not going to just check those things at the door. They're not going to be like the previous president that just, would befriend dictators all over the world and thought that that was the goal of his Russia policy, was to be friends with Putin, or we could go around other places as well, right? I think they've articulated that they're going to do both. They're going to engage when they can, contain when they must, and not check their values at the door. Those are the three pillars of their China policy, their Russia policy, their Iran policy. I think it's their analytic framework. The challenge, of course, that's easy to say. It's hard to pursue when you have multiple agenda items, right? So do you talk about autocratic repression in Iran, or do you get the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, done first? Interestingly, with respect to Russia, they signed the New START treaty and pushed it in the future before they've done any sanctions on human rights. So one strategy is sequencing. But then the second is just, it's really easy to say we're concerned and we're deeply concerned and we're deeply, deeply concerned. The Russians make fun of that word concerned in statements. I wrote many of them as a government official, and they make jokes about it. Oh, it's got two adverbs today. It must be really important. But that doesn't mean anything. Well, it means something. I want to be careful. It's better than not saying anything, which for many people, many millions of small d Democrats around the world, they lamented that for the last 4 years. But it's not sufficient. And I think, it's easy to sit in the White House Situation Room and say, we don't like the coup in Burma. We'd like to reverse it. That's easy. I would say that's an easy thing to say. But what are the instruments that you have available to reverse it? That gets really hard. And then how much energy are you willing to invest in that project versus all the other foreign policy projects you have, and then the domestic? And I don't want to answer that question. They've only been in power a few weeks. I think we should give them some time to settle in. But those are the real, those are the real dilemmas. The Russia one too. Are we going to sanction these economic actors and show that we're serious about saying something about the poisoning of Mr. Navalny? And I fear, since we've been on camera, probably his permanent arrest. Or do we have other things we want to do with Russia not so much? Or do we have other priorities where we don't have the bandwidth to do that? And that's the challenge of prioritizing your foreign policy agenda.
Bob, because you served in the region as ambassador to Indonesia, I'm going to put you on the hot seat now. Does the administration have any tools for dealing with a crisis like Myanmar, Burma? And is there a risk to making statements about the value of democracy, of due process of law, of the rule of law, saying things about Chinese malign interference and then not doing anything about it? That is, could talking about it and not acting be worse than saying nothing at all?
Starting with your last point, I think the answer is absolutely yes. The United States has to be in a position now, the Biden administration needs to be in a position where it distinguishes itself very clearly from countries of major concern, particularly China and Russia. We have to talk about values, and democracy is the fundamental value that the United States has attempted to promulgate, not always 100% without any question. But we certainly did this in the Obama administration. We did it in the Clinton administration and some other previous administrations. The issue, as I mentioned earlier, is the amount of leverage we have in Myanmar. What's critical, again, is the use of alliances and partnerships and relationships. Number one question, of course, is the willingness or non-willingness of ASEAN to take any kind of action. So far, they have shown little in the way of commitment in the last day or two. However, the mysteries of how ASEAN works sometimes demonstrate that they work very quietly and effectively. We'll see. They have done good things before. The United States needs to reach out to other countries. By the way, it's not clear that China was responsible for this or was a party to this coup. They may have been, but it's not clear. But we need to work with India. We need to work with the EU. We need to work with lots of other countries in the region to try to do this. We cannot, and the Biden administration may fail on this, and they may have to look for an alternative way of perhaps hoping for or trying to achieve elections in a couple of years. But what's very clear is that this is a first test case. And with the strong emphasis that this administration is putting on Asia, I'm sure that they will be pressing on this issue and not walking away from it.
Our tour of world issues is going to be necessarily haphazard because of the amount of time that we have. Maybe that's a reflection of what the Biden administration is going to deal with as well. Since this conference is being held, at least its physical base is in the Miami area, I want to ask two questions that are particularly relevant to audiences there. The first, Paula, is for you. What do you expect the administration to do on Cuba? And what do you think it should do? Because those may be different, especially when it comes to that regime's awful human rights record.
Well, I believe that, and I actually wrote an op-ed on this, and actually it has been acted upon at the end of the last administration, Global Magnitsky, which all of my colleagues know very, very well, which basically imposes sanctions and restrictions on individuals who have engaged, or institutions that have engaged on human rights abuses. But the appeal that I would make is it shouldn't only be about human rights. When you look at what has been happening in Cuba, you have massive corruption. And there are lawsuits that are taking place in Miami right now where you have Cuban doctors who have been trafficked. They have been used and literally exploited, where their passports were confiscated, their monies were taken, and they were basically forced to undertake, medical work, but not in a professionally respectful way. No, as trafficked doctors. And in this regard, I think it's horrendous. And actually, the State Department and Treasury, I believe it was earlier last month, the timing was where they actually imposed Global Magnitsky against a Cuban official who was directly involved in these matters. I think it's absolutely essential that we take action. I think Mike's words, I attach great importance to it. He's right. You can't just talk the talk and have rhetoric unless you really take tangible action. And in this case, Cuba, I think, has, as we have seen in, not in the last administration, but before, where there was a diplomatic overture, but nothing changed in terms of the human rights conditions. So my personal view is, I think Cuba has to fall into that Global Magnitsky. We need to be deploying it more and really show that we're taking action behind what we say about the importance of human rights.
Thanks, Paula. Bob, back to you for the second regional question. What do you think the Biden administration's approach to Venezuela will be, if there will be any approach at all? As you said, under Trump, it was all about Florida. What will Biden see things through the same lens? Will the country get any attention at all? What's your prediction?
Well, first, I have to say I disagree completely with my dear friend Paula Dobriansky about Cuba. The US has had a failed policy for 60 years, except for part of the Obama administration. That policy was a disaster. I even ran that policy for a few years when I was number 2 at the State Department for the Western Hemisphere. And you'd think that after 60 years, if a policy didn't work, you might want to consider changing it. In this case, we need Cuba's help regarding Venezuela. We need to leverage it. Cuba has played an outsized, grotesque role, I'm afraid, in the way we look at the world. And it's because of domestic politics, without any question. Venezuela is important. And here, I'm afraid the EU has let us down again with Borrell's recent action to diminish Juan Guaido's status, followed by the EU foreign ministers supporting him in removing him from being a top-level interlocutor to a secondary status.
Just background for everyone who's not following it, the EU recently downgraded the status of the opposition leader, Juan Guaido, who had been recognized by the US and other countries as the legitimate representative of the Venezuelan government.
Yes, we need to revitalize that. And again, I agree with Anne-Marie completely. We need to engage with the EU, with the Commission, and with the nation states that are involved and try to turn that around. We also need to work much more actively with the countries in Latin America and other countries around the world. China has a fundamental role in all of this, and it's really, though, an economic role. They don't really have much of a political role, I don't think. They want to be repaid. And I think there's elements potentially of a deal there as Maduro has further entrenched himself. But the United States, again, needs to establish a hemisphere-wide policy, not just a policy that's aimed at Venezuela and Cuba. And working with other countries throughout the region, we can re-engage them in even a stronger way than the previous administration did.
And you think that's going to happen?
It requires a lot of work. They came close. I think Elliot Abrams actually did a good job, but he was undercut by other parts of the American government. But again, the question is going to be priority. And a lot of this is going to mean, just like in the last part of the George H.W. Bush, Secretary Baker delegated the idea of finding a Central American peace agreement to Assistant Secretary Bernie Aronson. He did it. And again, I think it's really important to see what the State Department does in terms of finding the right kind of tools and the right kind of political strength to get this done.
Jonathan, may I just do a two-finger?
Sure.
A 30-second. Bob Gelbart smiling. We're very good colleagues, but I do differ with him on Cuba, and the fundamental reason why, because after the Obama administration opened up diplomatic relations with Cuba, changed the venue, tragically, I can't say genuinely that I have seen a change in any course of action on the part of Cuba. The situation is dire in Cuba itself in terms of human rights, in terms of human trafficking, in terms of corruption, and most significantly, Cuba has not been helpful to us on any diplomatic issue, no less Venezuela. That's why I think the imposition of Global Magnitsky is warranted. We've taken the other course of action. It didn't change their behavior.
Okay, thanks, Paula. I want to remind our audience that we're going to start taking questions from you soon with a special priority given to FIU students. So please send those in on the Q&A function. We're looking forward to getting them. In the meantime, Anne-Marie, I'm going to put you on the hot spot now and ask you about China policy. So the Obama administration's China policy, if I can summarize in an inevitably reductive way, was to find ways to balance both containment of China's more aggressive ambitions and engagement. And many have argued, and I think there's a lot to this, that that's the only approach broadly speaking, that one can take to China, because we can't simply do one and not the other. Then, of course, under Trump, it was the policy became a lot harder to parse, as his policy toward every country did. You had a very aggressive trade war, which many agreed was motivated by legitimate concerns, but conducted in a very, very incoherent and haphazard fashion. But then you also had these strange bouts of rhetorical effervescent praise for Xi Jinping himself. It was unclear how all of that fit together. What do you expect the Biden administration's approach to be? You know, we have a lot of people have commented that the staffing of the Biden administration makes it look like Obama's third term. Kurt Campbell and others reinforce that impression. Does that mean that we'll see a return to Obama's policies? And you know, one interesting thing is that Biden has said little to nothing about China trade thus far. And I'm curious if you have thoughts about why that is, given what an important issue it is.
Well, I think when Mike said contain where we can, engage where we contain where we must, engage where we can, and don't check our human rights and our values at the door, that was really a statement of China policy. I think Mike's right that it's going to apply everywhere, but it was, we have to contain in a number of areas, certainly expansion into the South and East China Seas, and also a number of the cyber policies, policies in Africa. There are a number of places where we really feel like we have to push back. We're going to engage where we can. That's, you know, we can't, there's no chance of having meaningful climate policy or global health without China. So you're going to have to engage. And then, yes, we're going to talk more about Uyghurs and more about Hong Kong and more about Taiwan, which is a truly critical possible flashpoint that we don't pay enough attention to, but should it suddenly become one, would be by far the greatest crisis with China that we've had in really probably certainly since the 60s or the Korean War. I again think, I'm gonna try this one more time, but the EU is China's biggest trading partner. I mean, to back it, Paula, that, you know, all Europeans complain about the EU and most Americans have no idea really what it is. But until Brexit, the EU was the largest economy in the world. And now it's a little lower, but it's, you know, it's a much bigger in terms of population. It's comparable to us in terms of economy, and in terms of regulatory power, the EU sets the standards for the world. We don't even compete half the time. So if you really want to have a meaningful policy toward China, you want to work to have a parallel agreement with the EU, and you really want to get the EU and the US together present on whether it's Venezuela or Cuba or China, or absolutely, as Mike knows, Russia, because EU trade with Russia is an order of magnitude bigger than US trade with Russia. So if you think that the power comes from economic relations, from political relations, and critically from regulatory standards, we should again turn east before we turn west. Or, I mean, when you look at it from Europe's point of view, Eurasia was around long before the United States was even regarded as a continent beyond the indigenous people who, of course, lived here beforehand. So it's really critical that we be players more than simply the United States looking around at the world. That's 20th century politics. 21st century politics is going to be much more in terms of how we engage others as regions.
I think that's a really critical point, because the Chinese tend to, understandably, pay a lot more attention to the things that the United States does, both at home and abroad, than the things the United States says. And a lot of China scholars, for example, have argued that one of the reasons we have saw this big increase in China's aggressiveness following 2008, 2009, in a marked departure from what had been China's the Chinese policy of trying very hard not to intimidate its neighbors, not to alienate the United States. The reason that switched was because of a Chinese perception that the 2008-2009 financial crisis had so damaged the United States' power and prestige that this was a moment of real opportunity for China. I'm sure they're thinking the same thing again, but it to a much greater degree. So how the United States responds in a material way, I imagine, will be much more significant in determining Beijing's thinking than what we say on things like Uyghurs or other human rights issues. Mike, we're short on time and we haven't talked about Russia enough, so I have to raise that with you.
I want to talk about China. No, just kidding. I'm just kidding.
I'm sure you do, but I'm not going to let you. So, you know, as Anne-Marie says, your point about both engaging where possible and containing where necessary is critical. But the Russia threat has gotten so much bigger in the last 4 years. We're no longer dealing with a country that merely has its own interests. We're dealing with a country that, as some Russian dissidents like Garry Kasparov and others argue, is actually currently engaged in what they call hybrid war against the United States. And there are lots of, war may be an inflammatory term, but you see lots and lots of examples of this, whether it's Russia's incredibly comprehensive and persistent hacking of the United States, to a degree to which the Russians have now penetrated much of the country's, the United States, I should say, key infrastructure. They haven't done anything with that control yet, but they've sent signals that they're there and could if they chose to. Russia's election interference, their use of little green men in countries on their periphery, their intimidation of neighbors. Russia seems to be mounting a sort of full spectrum press against the United States. How should the United States respond? There's been a lot of criticism, for example, of the fact that the United States has not responded that robustly to Russia's cyber attacks so far, and we're still waiting to see what will happen with the massive SolarWinds hack from the fall, the arguably the largest hack in history. So how does the Biden administration push back effectively?
So you're asking the should question, not will, right?
Well, let's do both if you have the time.
Should is easier, right? Well, predicting what they'll do is harder. I mean, just a couple of 30,000 and then, 5 feet off the ground. So at 30,000, it's like we were talking about before, it's, engage a mutual interest. That agenda is much smaller than it was in any time in US-Russian relations since the end of the Cold War. Contain, I think we have not had a robust policy of containment on multi-dimensions. We have a very reactive policy. Russia does something and then we look at our sanctions list, and that's not a strategy. That's not a strategy of containment on multiple levels. And then on the human rights piece, I would just say, you guys have talked about great power competition. I'm writing a book about lessons from the Cold War for great power competition in the 21st century. What you just said about China and their assessment of American power is exactly what the Soviets said about the United States in the 1970s. We just recovered from the 60s. It was a very tumultuous time. Then we had another, exogenous shock, to use a euphemistic word from political science, called the Nixon era, and him resigning, and we looked like we're in a mess. Their power seemed to be growing. Ours was waning. And we know how that story ends, right? That's what they got that wrong, and they overextended and they didn't focus on domestic reform. And we know how that story ends. The converse of that, I think, is true today, which is I think we in the West, in the United States, are underestimating Russian power right now. The typical image of, I give a lot of talks. I had a book come out a couple of years, including at FIU, by the way. And I hope to come back if Kramer's still on there once my book is out and we can travel again. The common image for most Americans is the Soviet Union is weak, it collapsed. They have these images of grandmothers selling fish on the streets that happened in the 90s. You need to erase that memory, okay? That Russia doesn't exist anymore. in terms of nuclear power, they're a superpower. In terms of conventional power, they're not a global power. But in Europe, we should be scared to death of the capacity that they have. And if you look at the balance of power on the border, just to echo again why Europe needs to be part of this, I'm really afraid of what's going on there. And to Bob's point about the Balkans, oh my God, you know, that is a crisis that hasn't happened, thankfully, but it almost happened. And I predict a lot of drama there. So economic, well, yeah, they're 10th or 11th, but Putin controls all those economic resources, gives him a lot of power. He can use those resources in a way that President Biden can't. And then ideological power that we have forgotten about. Russia is not promoting communism, that's the good news. But Russia is promoting, and let me be more precise, Putin is promoting a brand of orthodox nationalism, anti-multilateralism, illiberalism. He's very explicit about it. And you know, while we haven't been paying attention, he's been investing billions of dollars into that project. And he has a lot of allies around the world, especially in Europe, and even in the United States, by the way, where there's a big chunk of the Republican Party today that sounds a lot more like Vladimir Putin than liberal internationalists of previous eras. So, and then add to that, Putin, after 2014, especially when he annexed territory in Ukraine, that's when he said, you know, to hell with this international order, I don't care about their rules. I'm going to overtly be a revisionist power. I'm going to go after the system and I'm going to dare them to stop me. That's very different than President Xi. Just to compare those two, Xi never talks in those terms and he never acts in those terms, at least not yet. Putin, in that list that you just described, is out there, and he wants to see the destruction of the liberal international order, the European Union, NATO, etc. So I think the challenge is greater than we have been appreciating, number one. And therefore, you know, just to go back to where we started, I think Bob said this, we need a foreign policy, right? We need to have a grand strategy is a bad word, but a comprehensive, multi-dimensional policy. You know, and I think it's about the three pillars we already talked about, but when it comes to the containment piece, it's got to be across the board. It needs to start with allies. You don't want to be trying to contain Russia's nefarious, belligerent behavior abroad without allies. But that means then cooperating on multi-dimensions, including the things Anne-Marie was talking about. With respect to, you know, regulation in the international system. That's part of a global strategy of containing the revisionist powers. And I could go through it. Your old magazine, I published a piece in it a few weeks ago. I'll put it in the chat for people to look at. But it also means, and I think this is true of a lot of these questions, there's not going to be a resolution to the US-Russia policy, right? You know, I was very struck when I was in the government. Americans are kind of, forgive me, I live in the Valley, so this is, you know, this could be a Valley thing, but we're like engineers, right? There's a problem in the world and we say, okay, we need to go solve the problem. So we need to solve the problem of the coup in Myanmar, right? We need to solve the problem of Russian annexation of Crimea and intervention in Eastern Ukraine. And there are some problems that are not easily solvable in, you know, even within one administration. And you know, Kennan's on my mind because I'm writing this book right now. By the way, Atchison is too, for those involved in the debate about China. Remember, we made some big mistakes in thinking about containment back in 46, 47, 48, in my view. But sometimes you have to have this longer term approach of developing a comprehensive strategy that you may not realize the results of it for years or decades to come. And that, I think, is the right analytic framework to think about countries like Russia and China today.
We have a question now from an FIU student named Teresa Schuster, who studies political science there. She's asking about how we see the Biden administration addressing the Israel-Palestine question. And do we think the United States will continue to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital? How significantly will Biden's policy differ from the Trump administration's? I think it's actually a really great question because on one level, one would expect the Biden administration to want to have nothing to do with Israel-Palestine at this point. And yet, I always compare that issue to the great glowing bug zapper of American foreign policy. No president can benefit from getting involved, and yet, like moths, they're unstoppably drawn towards the glowing light, and then as soon as they get close, sure enough, bang, they get burned by it. And yet they come back to it again and again and again. So who's brave enough to take this on? Is Biden going to get involved? And you know, there is a strong reason to that doesn't just involve the strength of, for example, the Jewish voting constituency in the United States, but this is one area where, with the Abraham Accords, which led to numerous peace treaties and thawing of relations between Israel and Arab monarchies, the Trump administration actually did make real progress. And this could be an area potentially for some easy wins for the Biden administration. That's if they focus on relations with countries in the regions, but not Palestine. Palestine is still the really tough one, where you have a Palestinian government led by a moribund leader, Mahmoud Abbas, who is on death's door, has no succession plan, and has completely severed ties with Washington. Paul, I saw you raise a hand. You're on.
I don't have the precise answer as to what the administration will do, but I will say this. I am struck by the fact that a name, and I don't know if the student knows the name, but if she looks it up, Dennis Ross, who served in Republican and Democratic administrations. He just did actually a piece with Juan Zarate, who has served in a Republican administration. And the piece basically says three things about the Middle East. One, and it's overall about what do you look at in foreign policy from Trump going forward. It argues that it's never wise to do away, as a lot of times when there are transitions, that a new administration comes in and says, I'm not going to look at the past. So they caution against that. Secondly, on this issue, they say that there was a very significant paradigm shift with the Abraham Accords, from which a momentum can actually be built upon here. And they actually urge the administration to look at that in a broader context, because it's rather historic that you have this relationship, Israel, UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, no less Sudan, over there. But nevertheless, the point is, they argue, and especially Dennis Ross, I want to underscore him because he was immersed in what you just described, Jonathan, from administration to administration, knee deep in the Arab, Israel-Palestinian issue. He argues this is a base and a platform and a creative and innovative foundation from which to spring from. So my answer basically is, I hope that the administration will, in fact, look at that foundation and determine how to use it effectively in going forward, both politically and economically, as well as militarily for the region.
Jonathan, can I jump in?
Go ahead.
Just two things. So I agree that fundamentally the landscape in the Middle East is being reshaped by the Abraham Accords. You are seeing a big shift so that it's Israel plus the Sunni nations against the Shiite nations, particularly Iran. And as Biden gets back into trying to figure out whether he can revive an agreement with Iran, he's going to need to be working in the Middle East at least that much, not I think not Syria, not many of the ways we have before, but at least there. The one possibility here in terms of moving the ball with the Palestinians, I'm not going to talk about a comprehensive agreement, is that Israel desperately wants to be recognized by Saudi Arabia. And if it were Mohammed bin Salman, he would have done it by now. But his father, King Salman, is saying, no, we cannot recognize Israel without an agreement with the Palestinians. That's a big, big prize there, where Israel would get recognition from the ultimate Middle East power that it needs, particularly vis-a-vis Iran, and other Shiite countries, and possibly, although the Palestinians themselves, particularly Abu Mazen, the leader, as Paula said, is the biggest obstacle. If you could get something that looks like a two-state solution in return for this larger package, there might just be something important to get done. But beyond that, I think the Biden administration, like the Trump administration, no longer sees the Middle East as quite that glowing zapper that you described. It's much more a set of very discrete issues.
Great point. Thank
May I
you.
just add one sentence?
You may.
I believe the Biden administration will not move the embassy from Jerusalem.
No, it won't.
No, I think they've already said something to that extent.
They have.
In fact, Bob, stay with us because we have a question from a Miami Herald columnist, Fabiola Ortega, about Nicaragua. What should the Biden policy toward Nicaragua be? How do they pressure the international community to assure that the Ortega regime conducts a free and fair election with independent observers in 2021 in November of this year, when elections are expected to be held?
I mean, there was some very nice rhetoric in the Trump administration about Nicaragua occasionally, but very little in the way of action. Here too, it is critical for the Biden administration to work with the EU, with the OAS, with Latin American countries. And here is a case where we should be prepared to think very strongly about imposing serious sanctions. Sanctions are a tool that have often been overused or misused. Sometimes they're seen as a policy rather than a tool. But Ortega and his wife are people who have just been in office too long, and that regime needs to be changed. Free and fair elections are something which I think can be arranged. This is not going to be a high priority for this administration, I believe. However, again, I think the State Department should be working with Latin American countries and Caribbean countries to really try to put a strong squeeze on Nicaragua here. Mexico is critical. Colombia is really important. A lot of other countries within the hemisphere, as well as the EU.
Thanks, Bob. We have time for one last question, so I'm going to take another one from a student, Laura Vega, who asks, what can the administration really do to help the Uyghurs, China's Muslim minority in China? Should they look to sanctions under Global Magnitsky, or what policy could be more effective to actually address the hideous genocide, the cultural genocide at least, that China is undertaking there? I mean, the world is watching as a minority is being wiped out in a major country and that everybody is aware of, and nothing is happening. How can the United States, how can the Biden administration change that? Who wants to take it?
I'll say one word, which is I don't think
Okay.
the United States can do anything by itself. Just can't. China's a nuclear power. We are not going to be able to do anything really meaningful. I do think the only thing that might move China is a really big coalition, and it would have to include all the Muslim countries, right? All the Muslim majority countries who really would start to push on China is not the country it says it is as long as this is going on. That would include African countries, obviously Middle Eastern countries, Central Asian countries, as well as the EU and us. And that way you might just get them to think that the costs are much higher than they currently do.
And Jonathan,
And
I'll add a
unfortunately,
30
it seems that
second.
China's checkbook diplomacy, just to speak to Anne-Marie, has been so effective
I was just
that coalition is not going to happen. Did I step on your point, Paula? Go ahead, you make it.
No, I was just going to add a 30-second. I think that Anne-Marie is 100% right, that on something like this, it's about getting the voices of others en masse, but she critically underscored the importance of the Muslim voice.
Right.
And from a wide variety of regions. That's crucial in this case because China is very sensitive to its position globally. If that voice is heard across the globe, it'll be pivotal. And then secondly, the word genocide has been used in this case, and I think that is calling it what it is. and that has to be matched, those words, with action.
Great point. Unfortunately, I'm pessimistic about the former option. I've asked in the last 2 years Imran Khan, the president of Pakistan, this question twice. When and why is Pakistan not denouncing the treatment of its fellow Muslims? And he'll say very bluntly, because China is our friend, and China has come to our assistance when no other country can. And so we're not going to air these issues in public. And I agree with you that until that changes, we're unlikely to see much action. David Kramer has suddenly popped up on our screen, which I think is his way of banging the gong. So let me just say thank you all for this fantastic, really, really interesting conversation. Thanks to FIU for hosting us all. Bob, Paula, Anne-Marie, Mike, I'm Jonathan Tepperman. This has been fabulous.
It has indeed, Jonathan. Thank you very much. This is the only downside to doing all this by Zoom, which is you can't hear people in the audience applauding, but I know they are. I certainly am. Fantastic panel. My thanks to all 5 of you. Really, it was a tour de force, and we will pick up on quite a few of the issues you touched on in this conversation in later panels over the course of the rest of the week. But for right now, let me again thank all 5 of you for a terrific conversation. We are going to take a 29-minute break, and we'll be back at 1:30 Eastern time for our next session on great power competition. Thanks again, and we'll be back soon.
As a student who is interested in looking to go into politics in the future, having the experience of State of the World is one of the best things that we can get.
So at this event, we will see panelists throughout the 2 days from all walks of life. There are journalists, there are scholars, there are actual diplomats themselves, and they discuss prevalent issues to today's international communities.
Human trafficking is now part of the conversation.
Our original response on the 29th of December to their rocket attacks on us on the 27th of December was absolutely justifiable and right under international law.
I don't think that if you talk to any Democrat, they would tell you that impeachment was good politics for them.
This is an experience that students don't get on a daily basis, because despite the fact that you can learn a lot in classes and in lectures, you can't experience having a real-life policymaker, a real-life scientist there in front of you, explaining to you the intricacies of these foreign situations and conflicts.
You've assembled such an amazing group of people here that it's become this sort of meeting place early in the new year. So it's to really become the first conference of the new year.
State of the World proves that every concept we learn in poli-sci courses, in international relations courses, in any one of those social sciences, how they are applicable to real day issues and events that we are seeing.
Hopefully when you leave here today, you'll be enabled to have an even louder voice than you already have.
I think you've really established something here at FIU that you should be very proud of.